All right, we are back. This is Creativity is the Cure. I'm your host, Malcolm Moore, and today I have a very special guest, my good friend, John DeChristopher. How are you doing today, John?
I'm doing great, Mel. Thanks for having me.
Where are you talking to us from today?
I'm talking to you from my bunker. No, I'm talking to you from
An undisclosed location.
undisclosed location. I'm talking to you. Well, it may as well be my bunker. It's my drum room
Yeah.
where I do my podcast, and that is where I live in Cohasset, Massachusetts.
And when I looked up, I saw that you grew up in Melrose, Massachusetts. Is that far from where you are now?
It's about 35 or so miles north of where I live now. I moved down to what they call the South Shore of Boston
Yeah.
in the early 1990s. Zildjian, the job that I used to have, is located in Norwell, Massachusetts,
Right.
and I was commuting through Boston every morning, and that was no fun. So I moved down to the South Shore in 1992, and I love it down here. It's we're near the ocean, we're near the beach, and it's a great part of the area.
Yeah, you don't want to get stuck on Mass Ave, right? That's what I remember from the one time I was there.
Oh no, I get that. Yeah, no, at any time of day, you don't want to get stuck on Mass Ave.
And we have a lot of those out here in California, as you know, because you lived here for a while, right?
I did. Oh yeah, yeah. Yep. And I used to go out there all the time for work. I mean, I'll just say, I moved from LA back to Boston at the end of 1988,
Yeah.
and I mean, I wasn't sure that I'd ever go back there. Like maybe for a visit occasionally, and then I got
Right.
this job at Zildjian a few months later, and found myself out there about 8 times a year. So it's just kind of ironic.
Wow.
Anyway,
Well, let's
yeah,
talk about the way we know each other is over the years, I was in the music industry too. First, I worked at the great House of Guitars in Rochester, New York. I think that's when I
yeah,
first met you through maybe doing some clinics. And then my wife and I and our kids, we moved to Bryn Mawr, right outside Philadelphia, and I worked at Medley Music. And so I think from those two places, going to the NAMM show back and forth, you and I got to know each other well. And
yep,
for a while there, I was running Jerry Murata's website. And now I'm just doing Steve Gad's and Chris Parker. And I know all these guys are buddies of yours.
yeah. Too bad you couldn't find a couple of drummers that can play, but that's okay, Mal. You'll get some you'll get some good work.
They're fairly good. And most of them are tap dancers, as we know, right?
Yeah, no, I mean they are. Let's just take a moment and say, Jerry, of course, and Steve and Chris Parker, Steve Gad and Chris Parker.
Yeah.
I mean, just the absolute greatest guys. Besides their drumming, I mean,
Yeah.
they are just the greatest humans on the planet. Just
Yes.
love them.
And their ridiculous sense of humor, all very unique.
All very unique. Yeah, and happy belated birthday to Steve, who just turned 80 a
Yeah,
couple of
80
days
years
ago.
old. Wow, astounding. And he's apparently on tour with Paul Simon right now.
Yeah, yeah,
So cool.
that's
I hope
great.
I get to catch that one. Before we get deep into your history and what you're doing and what you're up to lately, I want to go way back in time. And I want to know
Okay.
what is your first creative memory? Now, I know that you're a drummer, and I know that all the jobs you did take a lot of creativity, but when was the first time that you thought of something and then executed it and brought that thought into the real world? When did you realize that you could use that creative part of your brain?
Well, that's a great question. I thought you were going to say, no, I know you're a drummer. So I thought the next part would be, so I don't expect anything creative, but I'm
Three
just so used
musicians
to
and a
that.
drummer, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Boy, going back to, well, I don't know if this counts, if this really answers the question, but, going back to playing in a band as a teenager, and when the band that I was in at that time decided to start writing our own songs. I don't know if that's a sort of answer you're looking for, but I
Yeah.
remember being really excited about the idea of coming up with like my own drum parts, playing
Yeah.
in bands for years, right? That, where we covered other bands, and you're kind of copying what the original
Right.
drummer played. And then, kind of that whole process where you actually are thinking about what you could play that would be, I mean, sometimes it is just a sort of simple beat, but something that really goes along with what the bass player is playing, and
Yeah.
something that really is different. And I remember this band that I was in at the time had a couple of name changes. We were Trigger, and then we were Voyager. And most of the same guys. And
Yeah.
then usually because we got in trouble at a nightclub and we had to change our name to get booked back there or something. But no,
For
but
people
the
listening, that's a
last
good tactic, by the way.
it is, yeah. Aren't you the same guys that came here and broke the bathroom faucet? No, 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 that's not us. No, we're the good old boys.
So that's great.
But
So you
no,
were taking, like, let's say you took a Rolling Stone song and first you would learn what Charlie played, but then you might just interpret it your own way and take it to another place, right?
sure, yeah, yeah, exactly. That's a great example. Or we write our own original song,
Yeah.
and it's an opportunity to kind of come up with a beat that could be in my own little mind something unique like what Charlie might play or
Yeah.
one of my heroes.
Something
Yeah,
to give it momentum.
exactly. Yeah.
How about your parents? Are they still around?
No, no, unfortunately, no, they're not.
Tell me a little bit about what they were like and what they did.
Sure, absolutely. My dad definitely was creative from the standpoint of like when I was really young, and it's funny to think about this now, but he had an electric guitar, like a cheap electric guitar and an amplifier. Like I can picture us sitting in the kitchen in our little house in Melrose and at the kitchen table, and my dad would have the guitar. He'd be sitting down, he'd have it sort of on his lap, and he'd play these little chords. And I remember the sound of that guitar through the amplifier, and I think he even had like a tremolo or some sort of I don't know if it was a whammy bar, but I can hear the sound of it sounding like that 60s almost surf guitar
Yeah,
sound. You know
like
what
a
I mean?
Dick
Like
Dale
that.
type of thing.
Yeah, yeah. And he just had fun. And then later I remember him having an acoustic guitar, and it got me to even though I'd started playing the drums as a teenager, he bought me an acoustic guitar and I tried to learn it. And I didn't have much luck with it. I didn't have the patience to try to really learn it.
Yeah.
But going back to that, my dad, dabbled with a guitar, and he was a great artist. He painted, and he would do oil paints and water paints, and he used to build, these really cool models, like a, scale of a model airplane or a
Wow.
battleship or something. And I don't know if you've ever experienced that or anybody, but I mean, it's like months of he'd come home from work and he'd sit at his little table and he'd have all these little parts and pieces and he'd be gluing things together and
Building
incredible
models, right?
patience.
That was a big thing back in the day.
It really was. Yeah, it really was. And we'd have them in the house. My mom was athletic from the standpoint of, she was an avid golfer. And I think she really encouraged us to, as me and my siblings when we were young, to try it. And we did. We all like golfed when we were younger. And I don't know, I shouldn't say she wasn't creative, but I don't know that was something that really spoke to her the same way it did to my dad, like, the arts. But she was certainly supportive of me as a young musician, as a drummer.
Well, they do say
Both my
that
parents.
these days that it takes, a combination of your left brain and your right brain to assert your creativity. And from what I know of you, at least in the early days, you're a real workaholic. Who did you get that from?
I probably got that from both of my parents. I mean, they were both hard workers, and
Yeah.
my dad really had the same job for the entire time that, from when I can remember until he retired in the 90s. He worked for Raytheon.
Okay.
And yeah, he was, like an old school guy that went to work every day and, worked hard. And that really set a great example for me when it was time for me to sort of figure out what I was going to do. And I remember I would call him for advice when I was thinking of changing jobs or thinking I was going to maybe try something else. And,
And you did a lot of
you
that.
know, yeah. And I will say he always encouraged me by saying, my dad was just an incredible guy, just all on his own, and he would say things like, and I find myself saying the same things to my son and both my kids, my son and my daughter, that whatever decision you make is going to be the right one because you know what's right and you're a hard worker and it'll all work out fine for you. And I have to say he was right. I mean, the couple of times I took chances and made a move that I wasn't sure was going to be the right move, it all worked out fine. So
Yeah, it sounds like you grew up in a
yeah,
really creative and supportive environment.
yeah, I think so. I would say so.
Do you think creativity can help people suffering from depression or things like anxiety?
Absolutely, no question in my mind. And I will give you a quick example. What I did mention is that my parents split up and later divorced, but they split up when I was in junior high school, like
Okay.
seventh grade.
Yeah.
And that was really, really hard. That was right when I got interested in playing the drums, right at that time. I was 11 years old. And I would
Wow.
tell you now that yeah, I mean, the drums and playing music were so essential. They were the foundation of me, I being able to go on sometimes because, I was really, really sad
Yeah.
about my parents splitting up as you would expect someone to be. And
That's tough.
I, yeah, I remember that, like knowing that I could come home from school and play my drums
Yeah.
was uplifting to me at a time when I needed that.
Some type of escapism, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, without a doubt.
Let's take a little walk through your career. Now, if I understand correctly, you started out with Wurlitzer?
I did. Yeah. After high school, I was planning to go to Berkeley College right here in Boston, and I decided to take a gap year because well, like a lot of kids, I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And studying music seemed like as a musician, it was the right way to go. Anyway, I took this gap year and I got a job at Wurlitzer, like a full line music store that had been around, I think, since the late 1800s
Oh
in
my
Boston. It
gosh.
was, it was the place, certainly in the 70s, EU Wurlitzer. And it was right by Berkeley College. It was on Newbury Street, right in the Back Bay area.
Yeah.
And it was I mean, give you an example, like all the big Boston bands like Aerosmith and the Cars and Jay Giles and the band Boston. I mean, they all shopped there, and
Wow.
really everybody. Yeah, I mean, and we had a dedicated, excellent drum shop there. So it wasn't just a music store that had a little place where they sold drumsticks and heads. I mean, it was like a full line drum shop where we had everything. And we had a great drum shop in Boston called Jack's Drum Shop, but we could compete head to head in terms of what we sold. And yeah, I mean,
Now, was that a chain of stores or was that the only one?
it was at the time I started working there was one other store in Framingham, Mass, just, kind of west of Boston and a suburb. And then we later opened stores in New Hampshire and in, I think, Belmont, Mass, which is, near Cambridge, and a couple of more stores opened during the time that I was there. But originally there was just, the main store in Boston and then the little satellite store in Framingham. But it was, it was the place. The Cars owned a recording studio across the street, so they were
Wow.
coming in all the time. And,
Oh man.
again, this was like, yeah, the late 70s, early 1980s, and that
Yeah.
was really the scene back then. So I worked there initially as, in the drum department, and then about a year or so into working there, I was promoted to drum department manager.
Right.
And all of a sudden I had like a really good gig for a 21-year-old kid that had thought it was just going to be a temporary thing until I figured out where I was going to go to college. And my band was working, and I ended up staying there and kind of deciding this was worth giving it a try, playing and working at this music store.
What a great way to dip your toe into the music business.
It really was, certainly at that time. And the people that I met along the way, and you and I met when you were working retail, and that's such a key part of it. Like, I met my future boss, Armin Zildjian, while working there. I met Steve Gad for the first time.
Oh man.
So Steve was doing a photo shoot for Zildjian, literally next door to Wurlitzer at this great photography at this studio that was a well-known place on Newbury Street. I don't remember the name of it, but it was a really great studio where they, had a great photographer working there. And my friends from Zildjian, who I knew from working at Wurlitzer for a couple of years at that point, came in and said, "We're shooting Steve next door. Can we just take a couple of cymbals to use for the photo shoot, and we'll bring them back?" I said, "Absolutely." And a friend of mine, who's still a friend, who we worked together for many years, Jerry Donegan.
Yeah.
I remember Jerry saying to me, "Johnny, why don't you come over in about 20 minutes or so with a couple of cymbals, and we'll get you in there and you can meet Steve." I'm like, "Oh, are you kidding me?" So I did. I went next door, and I go into this, and I can picture it. I go into this studio, and there are the Zildjian folks, and there's like a spiral staircase. And Lenny DiMuzio came over and greeted me, and he said, "Hey, Johnny, thanks for bringing these. Do you want to meet Steve?" And I said, "Sure, I'd love to." And now either I went up the staircase or Steve came down. He probably came down.
Yeah.
And this is a famous Zildjian ad where he had like a towel around his neck,
Yes.
and they had like water bottles. They were spraying him to look like he was sweating, but it
Oh,
was
that's
just,
hilarious.
you know, yeah, something like. And he came down and he met me, and I met him, and he was, he knows Steve. He was like, how you doing, man? And I had these gold drumsticks, this chain around my neck, and he looked at him. He said, "Wow, those are really cool. Where'd you get those?" And I almost gave them to him. I was
Yeah.
going to just go, "Here, take them." But yeah, I mean, it was probably 5 minutes, and I shook his hand, and I was just remember thinking like, in the couple of years before that, the late '70s, I discovered Steve and had become such a huge fan. So that was just mind blowing that I could walk next door and meet him. And I thought it was so, and he remembers the photo shoot, but obviously doesn't remember meeting me, but I remember it vividly. And so Steve is one person, but I mentioned Armin, Lenny, all those guys, and my future father-in-law, Vic Firth, which
Wow.
I can tell you a quick funny story, and I've told this many times, but Vic would come in. Now he was of course well known for being the principal timpanist for the Boston Symphony
Right.
Orchestra
Right.
for 50 something years. So
Yes.
the drumstick business came much later. That was just something he dabbled in for a while that just became a huge thing. But, he was at the time a legendary timpanist. And, you'd see him in the newspapers, you'd see him in the news and, in Boston because he was just so famous. So anyway, he was making at that time really mallets and like orchestral drumsticks, not really drum set sticks at the time. This was like the late '70s, early 1980s. And he would come in on Friday afternoon and deliver the mallets or whatever we had ordered on his way to a Symphony Hall gig. Like Symphony Hall was down the street. He'd come in his tuxedo, usually double park out front. It was like he was a hoot. He'd come in and he'd say, "Here you go. Here's the order. Um, you know, $60 or $80." And he'd say, "I need a check." And I'd go up to my boss, and my boss would say, "Just have him leave the bill, and we'll send him a check." And it was this back and forth. And Vic would say, I'm not leaving this stuff until I get a check." It was this, and that was the way he operated.
Yeah.
So it was just a funny little routine where we'd go through the same thing every time. He'd say, and I would literally call the house, leave a message, and place an order. Sometimes my now mother-in-law would answer the phone and take the order. And around 1981, he came in one day and he had a pair of American classic sticks in his hand, 5As, and he said, "You play rock and roll, right?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I want you to try these sticks and tell me what you think." And they were the first of what really are his main sticks now, the
Yeah.
American classic hickory sticks.
Wow.
And if you probably know the history, but prior to that, all the sticks were the maple, SD1 General and
Right.
the SD4 Combo and all those, like more orchestral types of sticks. But anyway, I remember playing these sticks and they were like nothing I'd ever played before. And I said, "How can I get more of these? We want to sell these." And he would, we'd get like a couple of dozen pair and be sold out within a couple of days.
Yeah.
Because, all the Berkeley kids and conservatory kids, things just started to take off. So it's kind of a cool memory to remember when all that started to happen.
Yeah, everything really began back then. And then how did you end up working for Simmons? I'm talking about the hexagonal drums.
That's a great story because, again, I was working at Wurlitzer, and in 1982, the man that started Simmons in America, he was an English guy named Glenn Thomas, and sadly, he just passed away recently, just a few weeks ago, sadly. And he was a friend right up until the end. But in 1982, we had bought the first Simmons SDS-5, which, as you say, was the first electronic drum set.
Are these the ones that had faces on the bottom like heads?
Yes, you could get them. You could order them specially that way.
That was crazy.
They were, yeah, they had all these custom modifications that you could do, and we just basically bought the straight. Remember, it was a black pads. They had,
right.
I think, black and white and maybe red at the time, but they were the hard surface too. They were remember him explaining that the surface was the same material that the the British bobbies, the English bobbies used for their riot gear, so it was like indestructible was how he described
Yeah.
it. And it really was. If you ever played one, Mel, it was like playing on a tabletop, and that many people did not like that about the
Yes,
pads.
wasn't there
But
something eventually that happened called Simmons Elbow when people were hitting these too hard like a wood table?
I think so. I played these for a couple of years. I never had any problems,
Yeah.
but yeah, that was something that people, and they did eventually change the
Right.
surfaces, but
Yeah.
on this particular occasion, so the deal was in 1982 we bought this set at the NAMM show, in the summer NAMM show, and Glenn would come into the shop and demonstrate them because they weren't something that you could just put on the floor and would just sell themselves.
Right.
So he came in. I recall it being in the fall, maybe September or something, and he was just this lovable, really charming man, just a great guy.
Yeah.
And he came in and he played great. We set these drums up and up in the pro audio area, and he did a demonstration, a clinic, and it was a small group of people. And one of the people in the audience was David Robinson, the drummer for the Cars.
Wow.
And he was someone, yeah, that was really into all the electronics. He had been using like the Syndromes
Right.
on all the Cars records. So he was very keen to learn about these drums. And Glenn did a great demonstration, and he and I hung out afterward, went and had some dinner and had a couple of beers. And the next day, David came in with his tech, and we fooled with it for like an hour in the drum department. And I'm pushing buttons trying to remember what I saw Glenn doing. And
Right.
we were all just, going, let's see what this does, and then him and David and his tech left. And a little while later, his tech came back and said, we're going to take these, put them on our account.
Wow.
So we sold the kit. Yeah. And it was not an inexpensive drum set. It was several $1,000s, a lot of money back then. So they bought that, and Glenn called me, and I'm making this story longer than it probably needs to be, but Glenn called me and said, I heard you sold the kit to the Cars. How about ordering another one, which I did. And we started selling those drums. We were the first store in Boston. And I was very proud of that we were the first ones, because not long after, within 6 months, certainly within a year, they took off, and all the shops in town wanted them. And we were sort of like, if they didn't have them in stock, we'd get the priority. And he was very loyal to, with regards to that. Fast forward a little bit to 1985, and I'm ready to make a change in my life and move out to LA and pursue music and my drumming. And I thought, well, I'm not going to go out to LA and think that I'm going to be the next Vinnie Colaiuta or Rick Marotta by any stretch. So I thought, well, who would I want to work for? Without a doubt, I was playing Simmons drums at the time, and I'd become very close with Glenn and some of the guys that worked there. And I said to Glenn one time in a phone call, would there be any possibility of working there if I were to come out there? And he said, I'm sure we could figure something out if you were to come out here or something. It was a very general, we're very busy, and I'm sure we could figure something out. And
Right.
And then when I really decided I was going to do it, I kind of made that decision. I called him again, and I said, okay, I'm really serious about this. I'm going to come out there probably next month. And he said, you come out here and I'll have something for you.
Wow.
And yeah, and true to his word, I got out there, and he immediately hired, within a couple of days of being there, I went up to see him, and he wanted me to start immediately. And, I started off working like in artist relations and, kind of doing tech support over the phone, because
Right.
I had an STS-7 and I could answer questions that people had enough so, I could walk somebody through.
And you were a drummer,
something.
so everybody was probably really comfortable talking to you too.
Yeah, exactly. And that I just remember the first couple of weeks working there, it was crazy because I met so many people.
Right.
Like heroes that I couldn't believe it. It was in Calabasas, which was just north of LA, beautiful little town. And all these drummers that lived in the valley were, well, LA. So
Yeah.
you know where that is. And, I met Vinnie Colaiuta and Danny Serafin and Chester Thompson. And
I've
J.R.
got to ask
Robinson.
you a question, because as a young drummer, there's probably nobody who made a bigger influence on me than Bill Bruford, especially when I was younger. Did you ever get to meet him? Because I know that he was really into the Simmons for, a couple decades.
He sure was. That's an excellent question, Mel. And I will tell you the answer. Yes. Very, very soon after working there, Bill Bruford happened to do a clinic at West LA Music on a Saturday. And I remember this. It was my first time going to West LA. And West LA Music, that is.
I remember that
And,
store.
you
Yeah,
know,
that was a big deal.
remember that store on Santa Monica Boulevard? Yeah, great, great store, which I later became, very familiar with. But I remember going down there, and a whole bunch of us from Simmons went, and I met Bill, and we hung out for a while, and he was just, like and I've met him a couple of times since then, but just another incredible gentleman, like this really, I can't explain it any other way than I just remember leaving there thinking, what an amazing guy. Like not just his playing, but just this
He's a brilliant
really,
guy. Yeah.
yeah, just,
One of the reasons why I brought him up, so as a young drummer, when I started hearing him play with King Crimson and Earthworks, his jazz band that he had later, playing melodies and chords, and he would program
right.
these into the Simmons drums. And that led me back to one of his heroes, Max Roach, who was one of those guys that did very melodic solos. So the combination of those two guys, not only playing rhythm, but melody was really beautiful to me.
Absolutely. Yeah. I didn't realize that Max was a big hero of his, but that makes perfect sense.
What's funny is for
like
the
you said.
listeners and you got to go back and check out The Drum Also Waltzes, the original with Max Roach,
Mhm.
and then listen to how Bill reinterpreted that in the 80s. It's really cool.
I will do that. I will. Yeah. I remember seeing, I don't know what the music show was, but I remember seeing King Crimson on like a cable TV music show.
Right.
And at one point, Bill, you probably have seen this. Bill goes up and there's just a wall of Simmons
Yeah.
pads
Yeah.
behind him. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And he's like you say, he's playing them like a keyboard. He's playing this melodic,
Yeah.
and it's incredible. And I think, he was so instrumental in taking Simmons to another place in
Yes.
terms of how people interpreted those drums. They weren't just these effects sounding little
Right.
analog
Right.
tom-toms. They were
I think he was one of the first guys that started using them as a controller too. He had his own rack sound modules.
Yeah. So I don't know if you remember when Yes had this reunion tour, and I think
Right.
it was 1990 or 91.
Yeah, I went to that.
It was both Bill and Alan White
Yes.
playing drums. Yeah. And so Alan and I had become very good friends when I worked at Drum Workshop, and then went over to Zildjian, and I got him playing our drumsticks, and Alan was a very good friend. But I remember going to the show in Boston, and he said, "Would you like to say hello to Bill?" And I said, I met him. Don't know if he'll remember me. And he was really polite. He probably didn't, but he remembered the clinic at West LA Music. So this would have been about 5 years later.
Right.
By then, Bill was playing the SDX, like the state-of-the-art Simmons, and he was talking about that. And Alan was playing the acoustic drums. And it was a really, really cool to hear both of those sounds together, like hearing them play together and hearing the acoustic drums and Bill playing the Simmons and what he did with them. And it was an amazing concert.
Yeah, that was a crazy, I think it was like the Union album where they put
That's
both
what it was,
versions
yeah.
of the band, right? Like the 70s and the 80s. And they had Trevor Rabin, I think, was in there, right?
That's right. Yeah. Trevor Rabin and Steve Howe. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I think both guitar players were there. Yeah.
Now, how did you get from Simmons to DW? By the way, I love your podcast episode with John Good. I really learned a lot from that.
Oh, well, thank you. I was going to say, when you said, how did I get from Simmons to Drum Workshop, I was going to say the 101 freeway west, but north, whatever.
You're making me think of the Saturday Night Live skits about when they're talking about how to get, with Bill Hader and Fred Armisen.
Oh, that's hilarious. Yeah.
You only understand that if you live here.
Exactly. So basically, I was at Simmons about a year, a little longer than a year. I started there in like July of 1985, and in September of 86, things were changing, and Simmons had a lot of competition at that point between Yamaha and Roland, and electronic drums seemed to be, it wasn't what it had been a couple of years before that.
Right.
And so make a long story short, things were changing within Simmons, and my job was probably, because I had been moved into sales at one point, probably pretty safe, because the sales guys were the ones that were kind of keeping the lights on, so to speak. But one night I got a phone call at my house from Don Lombardi, who I'd met a couple of times at clinics and just around town. He had gotten my number from someone. And I don't know if you know Don, but he's this very happy, cheery guy. He said, "Hey, it's Don Lombardi. How you doing?" I said, "Oh, hi, Don. How are you?" And he proceeded to tell me that, my name had come up because he is looking for someone who could run their sales department and, do artist relations and wear, a few hats as he prepares to launch DW Drums, like officially.
Yeah.
This was like the fall of 1986, and he was looking to do this
Well,
launch in
at that
January of
point,
87.
am I correct in remembering before they went into drums, it was just drum pedals, right? Because I remember those.
That's right. Just the pedals and hi-hat stands. They hadn't even really, before I started working there, he hadn't even really started making cymbal stands yet. I remember getting the first prototype cymbal stands. So he was
Wow.
really just in the bass drum pedal business, and to a lesser degree the hi-hat stand business. And that was
Yeah.
his. But he made, and you saw this in John Good's episode on my podcast, where they were making drums as sort of custom one-off special orders, but they weren't really a drum company yet.
Right.
And their history, is better to kind of learn their history from them. But my recollection, and John confirmed this, is that in the late 70s, Camco sold the tooling and some remaining parts to DW,
Okay.
and they sold their name to Tama Hoshino.
Oh, okay.
So Camco, the name Camco, is owned by Tama Drums, Hoshino,
Interesting.
the parent company. Yeah, but DW, of course, the lug stot design and all the tooling that goes with that, of course, is DW. So, in fact, Tama, for a minute, literally a year or two in the late 70s, introduced their version of Camco drums that were very good. They were made in the
Wow.
USA, and the lug was a little different. It was like a more oval shaped lug.
Yeah.
Not exactly like the round Camco lug, but I think there wasn't enough interest in those drums, so they proceeded to just move forward with Tama drums. But I can go on that. But in any case, so Don, asked if I'd like to come up and see the operation, which I did, and I took a ride up there after work one night, and I liked Don, just spending time with him and him taking me around the factory and telling me what his vision was. And
Was it in Oxnard then?
no, it was in Newbury Park, which is Thousand Oaks.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Just past Westlake, and so they had moved up. They were in a small 2-unit industrial park, and yeah, so I went up there after work and liked what I saw. We had dinner and talked about things, and I just, I think I left it something like I really need to think about this, and honestly, I felt like if I was going to make this kind of a change, it had to be worth it to me. We had found out we were expecting our first child, my son.
Wow.
And I thought, if I'm going to make a move like this, I don't want to regret it, and I don't want to wish that I had negotiated something better 6 months from now. And
Right.
that was a time in my life when I was kind of learning about things like that. I was still only about 25 and figuring a lot of that stuff out. But we came to an agreement, came to terms on what would be a good compensation. And the hardest part then was going to be to tell Glenn that I was making this change. But, Glenn being Glenn, he was just such a great guy about it. He totally understood. He knew that I was expecting a child, and I think he knew there was some uncertainty at Simmons,
Right.
and wished me well. God bless him, man, because I would see him for years after that at NAMM shows when he'd be there, and he was just as nice and kind and great as he ever was, Well, so I worked for DW, as you say, out in California, and at a point, it just felt like I needed to be back on the East Coast with our little, 18-month, almost 2-year-old son, and flying back and forth so that, my parents and our families could kind of get to know the first grandchild. And,
Yeah.
and I knew that was going to be hard. I knew it was going to be hard living out there and having a child and not, only being able to have him see or have them see him at, certain times a year. So made the decision. And again, that was a hard decision to move back east. But thanks to Don, he allowed me to do it working for DW still, not having to start over when I got to the East Coast. So basically, when I moved out there at the end of 1988, I was DW's East Coast office, working out of my home office. And I was kind of doing a lot of the same stuff I was doing in California, except from
Remotely.
the East Coast,
Yeah.
remotely. A lot of it was done by telephone. Difference this time is I could drive into Boston easy enough, or down to New York and visit dealers in person, which I couldn't do when I worked in California. So there was a benefit to it. And, I'll share this for the young listeners to know in terms of the business side of it. My compensation changed from being a salaried employee to a commissioned employee.
Wow.
Yeah, and the good news was that DW drums were starting to take off after a couple of years of really all of us pounding the pavement. I mean, it didn't happen overnight. It wasn't like I said to John in the podcast. It wasn't like one day we decided we were going to sell drums and it was just a success story instantly.
Yeah.
It was really hard. I remember some of the dealers that are still around today that are DW's biggest dealers telling me, we don't need another drum company. We have, yeah. I mean, I would hear that and I go, I understand. I know what you're saying. Like, I have no comeback to that other than let me just send you, try these drums
Right.
and tell me what you think and see if you can sell them. But we sell Ludwig and we sell Yamaha and Tama and Pearl. We don't need any more drum companies. But anyway, we were pretty relentless in terms of trying to get the brand out there, signing artists and all that. And so anyway, I moved out there back east the end of 88 and it was going fine. I came back to LA for the NAMM show in January of 89, still working for DW. And I happened to go by the Zildjian booth to say hello to Lenny DiMuzio and my friend Colin Schofield, who I got to know, who worked there. And Colin was in charge of marketing. And he said, do you have a resume? Because your name came up recently and we're looking to make some changes, and I heard you're living back on the East Coast now, and wondering if you'd want to come down and talk to us. And I remember asking like what the job was, and he was kind of coy, didn't really want to say anything. And so I think we had a phone conversation when we all got back on the East Coast. I think we spoke on the phone, and again I asked, what exactly is it, and he gave me a little more information, and I went down and interviewed and. I'd never been to Zildjian, which is just kind of funny because I grew up 30 something miles away and
that's
all
crazy.
those years, I know, working at Wurlitzer, and they had extended the invitation down there several times, but I just never made it down there. And I went in for the interview and I liked, the operation and I liked everybody there and knew many of the people already and got a sense for what the job was, which was going to be artist relations. Lenny DiMuzio, who, was a legend, had done that job forever and continued to do it, but he was moving toward education, and Zildjian really wanted to sort of, beef up that part of the business. And they were looking for someone who had experience in artist relations, which I had at that point. So, I seemed to be a worthy candidate, at least, to come down and have an interview. And I did. And I was invited back to come down and meet with Armin Zildjian.
Wow.
And and that was
that's a big deal.
Great. I'd met Armand a couple of times, and I knew that I had to have his blessing, for this to work. And
right.
I remember sitting in his office, and Lenny was there, and Lenny was kind of smiling and, giving me the kind of thumbs up. And and it was a great, Armand was asking me if I knew, Peter Erskine, or if I knew Steve Gad, or if I knew this guy or that guy. And he was asking a lot of the right questions. And I'll just share this funny thing. I remember this like it was yesterday. And his daughter, Craigie Zildjian, who of course now runs the company,
mm-hmm.
who later became my boss, she was in the meeting as well. And she had my resume and she was kind of marking it up and asking questions. And she said something like, well, it looks like you've moved around a lot. You worked for Simmons and then you went over to DW and now you're back here on the East Coast. And how do we know you're not going to leave here in a couple of years and move around?
Yeah.
And it was a good question. It was the right question to ask. And Armin said, Craigie, for crying out loud, I like this guy. Just hire him and give him whatever he wants.
You couldn't get a better stamp of approval than that.
No, I couldn't. And I had to kind of keep a straight face because I didn't want to blow it and just kind of, burst out laughing. But her and I laughed about that years later. But he was so great to me. And, another mentor like Glenn and like Don, and like my own dad, just an incredible guy,
Wow. I found an article you wrote for Modern Drummer maybe at least 10 years ago, and you said you end up leaving the music industry because it had been changing. What were the changes that made you decide to leave that industry and go into other things?
Well, first and foremost, probably auto-tune. No.
No, I think you mean Beat Detective, right?
Yeah. Well, I think to be fair, I mean, it was changes, everywhere, not just Zildjian. It became more and more difficult to do the kind of work that I had been accustomed to doing,
Right.
which I felt was my best work. The industry changed to, I would say that the drum industry, probably the entire music industry, and when I say that, I'm speaking about the business that I came from, which is the instrument manufacturing side of it.
Right.
That business is not growing, and I think one could make the case that it's shrinking.
Right.
More and more kids are opting to do other things than play instruments like when we were kids.
Right.
And, that obviously has an effect on all these companies. And so the result of that, Mal, is that you see companies start to tighten their budgets, and
Right.
things that you could do before tend to be taken off the balance sheet. There's no longer the money to do this or the money to do that. I think of some of the things we used to do at NAMM shows, some of the, like,
Groove
yeah,
night.
Groove Night, Groove
Oh
All
man.
Stars, things like that. And Zildjian was a big sponsor of that. We'd kick in a lot of dough to
Right.
help
Right.
defer the cost of that, and because it was such a great event for the entire industry, and I could bring dealers, or I could bring artists. I'd have 10 or 15 passes, and it would be a way for me to take a bunch of drummers out for the night to this great show, and it was a blast.
Yeah.
So my point is that things like that were becoming, less and less part of what we did in the industry. And I could see it going in a direction
Right.
that I knew it wasn't going to go back. And a lot of this stuff started to happen after 2008, when, when the whole economy just kind of went off a cliff, and we
Yep.
we all sort of clawed back, for a year or two, and things started to kind of come back to normal. But what generally happens in those situations is, in any situation, if you have, $100 to work with, and then because of something that happens, they cut it down to $80.
Right.
When things get back to normal, you're probably only going to have $80. You're not
Right.
going to have your $100 again.
Right.
And I, again, I certainly don't want to put this all on Zildjian, but I found that those battles that I used to be able to win, I couldn't win anymore. And it
Yeah.
was just becoming harder for me to do the best work I could. So,
Yeah. I mean, for good or bad, it has definitely changed significantly.
yeah.
So, right around, you were just saying 2008, let's go 3 years before that. How did Mission from Gad, how did that materialize? That was one of the coolest things I ever saw you do.
Well, thank you. I've been wanting to acknowledge that, here we are now in April of 2025, that it's exactly 20 years ago when we did that,
That's crazy.
which is so hard to believe. I know.
I
And we were
remember you
celebrating
emailing
Steve's.
me photos of the bus like it
Yeah.
was yesterday.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
I know. I know. Yeah. And we were celebrating Steve's 60th birthday at the,
Oh my
at the
God.
time, which
That's-
is just so funny to think about that.
So, who came up with
But,
the idea and how did it materialize?
Well, I came up with the idea, and I'd been talking with Steve to do this clinic tour. It was many, many months of not only the preparation for the tour, but backing up months before that of just trying to get him to agree to do it. And I mean, we were talking about it in 2003 when we paid tribute to him for the American Drummers Achievement Awards. And
Right.
that was that show that I produced at Berkeley. And
Oh, that's a great
that-
DVD. I still have it.
that was a high point in my career. And that was really the beginning of Steve and I really getting close. I mean, we were in regular contact as I planned that show, and he helped connect the dots with getting James Taylor and Paul
Right.
Simon there, and James's band. But anyway, I was saying to him, Steve, it'd be so great if we could go out there and get you back out doing clinics. People are always asking. And so, a whole year went by, really. 2004, we came out with the session series line of cymbals.
Right.
And I remember saying to him, again, we could really promote these if we could do a clinic tour. And I said, we could get a van, you and me, maybe one other person, maybe Joe Testa, I don't know, but we'll get a van and we'll take the same drum set. Because one of his concerns, or, I remember him saying, well, man, it's just so hard to get comfortable to go play a different drum set every day. And,
Right.
I like to be comfortable with it. And I said, I totally get it. What if we did that? What if we took the drum set with us in a van and we just drive up the West Coast? We start in San Diego, we finish in like Seattle or something. And we hit a bunch of just drum shops, not music stores, but independent drum shops, 5-star drum shops.
Yeah.
And he loved that idea. He loved the idea of going to drum shops.
I think I've run Steve's website for like more than 25 years. One thing we always run into is, every day there's 20 people saying, can you give me drum lessons, or can you do a clinic here? Was that a way to offer people the experience to see him in a clinic in a way that could reach more people, and then a little bit easier for Steve to do it all at once?
Exactly. And the fact that it was drum shops, I felt was important because, with all due respect to chain stores, the drum shops know how to put the clinic on. They know how to promote it.
Yeah, they're drummers.
They're drummers, and they invest the equity. They invest the blood and the sweat into making sure that we're going to have a good turnout. You're not going to show up, and you're not going to have some guy in the middle of the floor saying, "Oh, there's a clinic tonight. Oh, shoot, I didn't know that. Really? No one told me."
Right.
And there's drums in boxes that haven't even been taken out yet.
Yeah.
In a heap. So that was to avoid all that, because I've been through that now many times.
Yeah. So you took the experience of your whole career and you're like, all right, the logistics and the practicality of this, I know how to do this.
Exactly. And it has the potential to be incredibly big and incredibly successful for everybody. And so I will say Steve gets the credit for the idea of the tour bus, because the whole idea of the van, he was warming up to that, to the idea of us not flying, basically. Let's avoid having to fly anywhere. Let's just be able to just drive we'll drive a few hours every night, 4 or 5 hours, or sleep and then drive a few more hours the next day and get to where we're going.
Yeah.
And he said, well, what if we got a bus? And I went, that might cost more than a van. I need to look at that. So we started looking at the idea, and it was not cheap, obviously, but again, the potential for what we could do.
Right.
Taking, and the idea then grew to, let's bring a bunch of prototype cymbals with us, and in the afternoon at West LA Music or wherever we're going, we'll have a big sale where we'll sell a bunch of cymbals, and that'll help defer some of the costs.
Well, let's be honest too. I mean, he's got all these other companies, Remo, Yamaha, LP. I'm sure they kicked in and they appreciated all the free advertising almost, right?
Yeah, they were willing to, but the first couple that we did, the first couple of tours, we actually declined their offer for financial support, because we wanted it to be just Zildjian. We wanted it to be, some of the other companies weren't real happy about that from the standpoint of wanting to be involved. But, I assured Yamaha and Remo and Vic Firth and everybody that you're going to get exposure. He's going to be using, there's going to be a logo on the bass drum. And he would, and Steve, I would never tell him not to do this, but every night he would say, I want to thank all my companies, Zildjian, Yamaha. So he would thank all the companies.
Oh, so that's great.
And, yeah, he would do that. So,
well, not for nothing, but Zildjian, who else has been around more than 400 years?
Right, exactly. And it was something we felt like, let's just try to do this on our own. And, for lack of a better way of putting it, try to reap the benefits of us doing this and having it be our way, not feel like we have to tweak it or change it a certain way so that all the companies can do their thing. Let's just do it how we want to do it and see how it goes. So
no compromises and keep it simple, right?
Exactly. And that's what it was. It was no compromises. I mean, it was a really well done tour. And that very first one we did, which was right at this time, 20 years ago, April of 2005, I've never seen crowds that size. I sound like somebody else. I'm scaring myself. I don't want to say that. But I mean, this thing was
that's
promoted.
All we'll say.
Yeah, that's all we'll say. But this was promoted by all the dealers. I mean, they really got behind it. We were going to like St. Louis and everything, the criteria were like, you need to have a separate venue. We're not going to do this in the store and limit it to 100 people, because that's how many people you can cram into your store. We're going to do this in a proper venue. We're going to do this right. And we were getting, like 800, 1,000 people. The one that we did, I remember at the drum pad in Chicago, Illinois, 800 or 1,000 people. It was incredible. Every gig, and Steve was having a great time. And I'll back up a second now. When it started, the idea started to really come together, and he was leaning more toward doing it. He came to the NAMM show that year, January of 2005. And I persuaded him to come to a dealer reception that we were having in one of the suites we had. And I said, Steve, I want you to come with me and just come and meet some of the guys that own these drum shops. These are all the people we're talking about.
Right.
And he did. And I introduced him to like Jim Pettit from Memphis Drum Shop and Gary Forkum, who used to own Forks Drum Shop in Nashville, and all the independent drum shop owners, Wes that owned Explorers Percussion. And he got such a great feeling, and he said, yeah, man, I think this would be cool. Yeah, let's do it. So we did. And because up till then, he still wasn't sure. He had like a small window between Eric Clapton and James Taylor, and he just wasn't sure, like, that he wanted to spend 3 weeks doing this in between. And it worked out great. And then from there, we did another one.
How many of these did you do altogether?
So we did 3 in the U.S., in 2005, we did 2, and then 1 in 2006 on the East Coast. We did 2010, so 15 years ago, we did Europe. We did that in 2 legs. Right about this time, we started the first leg in 2010 in Europe, and then had to reschedule part of it for the fall of 2010 due to volcanic ash.
I was going to bring that up. I was going to say, do I remember you guys had some challenges due to a volcano?
Yeah, we couldn't get over to Europe.
Where was it? Was that Italy?
Yeah, I think we had to cancel. We managed to get to Italy and Germany at the beginning of it, but I think we couldn't go to Scotland or Ireland or some of these other places until the fall. Like we couldn't get flights over there. I remember flying into Amsterdam. And then from there, we proceeded to Holland and the Netherlands, and then, Holland. And then from there, I think we went to Germany, Italy, Spain.
So here you are, you're John DeChristopher, you're meticulously planning every single thing that you need to know about. And then a volcano erupts.
Yeah. Literally, my wife and I were watching the news one morning, the day that I was leaving. And they were talking about all the flights that had been grounded. We'd heard something about this, and I really didn't pay much attention to it. And then that day, they were talking about all the flights, and I had an email from my travel agent saying, give me a call because we got some problems. And I think we had to cancel the first 2 or 3 dates, and he was able to get me on a flight so that we could resume the tour like the 4th day in. And that was, I think, in Holland or Amsterdam or someplace.
And was that the last tour?
And then there was one in South America in 2011.
Wow. I actually didn't know about that one. Wow.
Yeah, that was just a few dates in Brazil and Argentina and I think Chile.
Wow.
Yeah.
And most importantly, I've heard a rumor. Is this true that Steve Gad likes to juggle salt?
He would do that. Yes. So, Steve. I mean, the best part, I mean, it goes without saying that being with him during the day, during the night, watching him play every night from 5 feet away. I mean, incredible. But spending time on the bus and watching him juggle salt was, I mean, it was some of the funniest stuff.
There's a video of it. I don't know if you posted it, but it's hilarious.
It is. I've seen it. I think I don't think I've posted it though, but it's hilarious. Yeah.
Yeah. And then he's got, what was the video too he did when he used to be a drummer, but now he's selling pizza?
Yes. Well, I'll tell you how that came about. So these 2 young guys from Italy, Alessandro Lombardi, I think his name is, and James Payne. I remember their names, and they called themselves the Drum Brothers. And they were a couple of young Berkeley students, really good guys. Good. I don't want to say good kids, but good. I met them many, many years ago when they were at Berkeley, and I'd see them when I'd go up there for stuff. And they had approached me. They came to Zildjian one day, and they had a podcast or something, and they interviewed me. And they said, "We'd love to get Steve Gad. Is it possible?" And I said, "Well, I can ask. Everybody wants Steve, and if there's ever a time that he's in Italy maybe, and could work out or something. So it turns out he's in Italy with James Taylor, and I was still working at Zildjian at the time, so
Yeah.
this would have been 2010 or 11 or 12, and
Wow.
it turns out I guess he was in Milan, which is where they live, and I coordinated with Steve and with them for him to do this, and I came up with the idea of, I said, guys, you got to make this a little more interesting than just having Steve play 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover. So I knew Steve would love this. I said, how about you have him show up, knocking on the door, delivering a pizza, and then he sees you guys. I played director because I knew this would totally tick the boxes for Steve. This is right in his wheelhouse.
Most people don't know he's got such a terrific sense of humor. So go on.
Yeah. So I said, and they were kind of like going, what, really? Huh? And I said, no, trust me. He shows up and he knocks on the door. He's got a pizza and he's saying, hey, I'm the pizza guy. And, oh, you guys are drummers? Hey, I used to play the drums. I think I remember a few things. And my idea was he'd sit down and start playing, something like late in the evening or something he played with Chick. And he did a little, little audible on his own when he got there. But you saw the thing. He knocks on the door. Hey, pizza guy. I used to be a drummer. And
I teach private drum lessons out here, and it's hard enough to teach the kids how to play 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover, but to be able to sing a song in a different time signature at the same time. Oh my God.
I know. That's the genius of that little bit, is that he's playing that and singing that. I think that gets lost on some people.
It's almost like something you'd see Ricky Gervais do. It's just brilliant.
Yeah. I was very proud of that, because Steve, and Steve, when later said something to me, he said, how did you like that? Did you think it was funny? And I'm like, are you kidding me? I just laughed for 5 minutes solid until my stomach hurt. Like, God.
Yeah. Well, let's take a second to talk about your awesome podcast, Live from My Drum Room, where no drummers are harmed on any show. Did that start as a blog and then turn into a podcast? What's the history of your podcast?
Well, I think I might have used that little tagline years before, just to think it was cute. But I did have a blog years ago, but it was really unrelated to this. This I started 5 years ago, no surprise, when a lot of us were just looking for something to do.
Yeah.
And I had watched and heard enough podcasts to kind of get an idea of what people do and what they talk about. And I felt like, if nothing else, it could be a fun thing to, kind of record and document some of these drummers like Steve and Rick Marotta, that have certainly been documented by other people, but by someone who knows them and can maybe get a little more inside.
Right. And different stories.
And different stories, exactly. And the very first one I did was with Rick, really just as a test. He and I'd never done any sort of live stream anything, and I didn't even know what I was doing. And I remember hooking up the camera and the stream, and then there's Rick and I, and we were live on Facebook in front of like probably thousands of people in those days, because people were on Facebook all day. And I'm saying, yeah, I can see you, Rick. Can you see me? And we're talking, and then it just got to be funny because it was Rick, and he just started saying things that, would be, that just are funny, and it felt comfortable. It felt like it was something that I could sort of work with. And then my first real official serious one was with Steve.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to say, not surprisingly, when I saw the sort of response from people, I remember looking at it after I'd streamed it on Facebook, and it was something like 10,000 people or 15,000
people get really excited. And one thing I like about yours is just surprises. I was watching the one with Rick and Steve the other day, and then Willie pops on. So you never know what's going to happen. That one was really funny.
That was great. Will was putting all these comments in there, and I texted him. I said, Will, here's the link. Why don't you jump on? And and it was just so cool for him to. And they're all such great friends that it was seamless. Like he just jumped right into the conversation. But thank you for talking about that, because I got to a point where, not that I didn't enjoy it in the beginning, but I really felt like I wanted to get a little more polished and a little more serious about it.
Yeah.
And I started to put more effort into it. And I think it's gotten better as time has gone on.
I think so too. I really look forward to him. And you've interviewed so many people that have inspired me, but I'm wondering for you personally, who's your dream interview that you haven't done yet? Who would you just love to interview?
Oh boy, I have a handful of people. Of course I'd love to get Ringo.
Yeah.
I never bother Greg Bissonette about it because that's just a no-no. Greg knows that if he's going to continue to be Ringo's drummer, the last thing he should ever do is say, "Hey Ringo, John, well, he's got this podcast." And so I'm hopeful that I could eventually sort of break through and through maybe his manager, who I know a little bit. But Ringo would be a dream.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of there are a few other.
Let me ask you, what about
drummers.
Who I would love to see you interview is singers who a lot of people don't know are great drummers, like Paul McCartney or Stevie Wonder. I mean, those are two, or Lenny Kravitz, people that are known for one thing, but maybe you and I know they're also really good drummers. They're those people who can play all the instruments on a track.
That's a great idea. I hadn't thought of that. And Stevie Wonder, my God.
Man, his hi-hat work is ridiculous.
I'm a huge fan of Stevie Wonder's drumming, of everything, but of his drumming and certainly of Paul McCartney too. And
well, think about Paul when he did that first album, and he was one of the drum tracks. I think he was playing on couch cushions. Just the innovation of these guys.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'd been trying to get Russ Kunkel for some time, and
wow,
Russ,
that would be great.
And we came close a couple of times, and he's just so busy touring. And I reached out recently, and he sent me the nicest response. It was just the most, and he just said, "I'm so sorry. I've got to be." So he said something like, in typical Russ, humility. He said, I'm probably the worst guest you could ever have because, I'm never available or something. I said, "No, you're the best guest because you're never available. That means you're busy.
You're the holy grail."
Said, yeah, exactly. He said, "Let's try for the fall." So hopefully that's going to happen.
All right. Fingers crossed on that. Yeah.
Yeah. Fingers crossed. But, I've got a couple of, I think, cool little surprises in store. One guy, I can tell you who it is. And you might laugh at this, but since you know the 80s pretty well, I was in touch with an old friend who I got to know when I was working at DW by the name of Jerry Spicer, who is the drummer for Men at Work.
Oh, I love his drumming.
Yes,
yeah, he's got
drummer,
really iconic fills.
He does, and he's got a great groove, man. He, really listen to those songs, and he really could groove. Great feel. And we reconnected recently, and he was aware of my podcast, which was nice. And I think he was a little surprised to hear from me. And he's actually busy doing some stuff. But I said, let's check back in, middle of April, end of April, and we'll figure out a date. But
that is an incredible idea. A lot of times when I'm teaching kids and they hear Earth, Wind, and Fire, and they're like, they did that with a computer. I'm like, no, dude. Back then, you had to play that well. I mean, you hear the Men at Work tracks. They're incredible at a time when drum machines were taking over. Here's a guy that just had his own groove that sounded like nobody else.
That's right. I mean, he could play, and he could play in time. And like you said, he could come up with great parts and great fills that were inventive. And
I do miss hearing music and go, I could tell a drummer by his drum roll, and because of Beat Detective now, everything is kind of on the grid, and it's harder to get the personality through. And that's why I love if somebody like Foo Fighters records in Dave's garage and they just play live, and if they make a mistake, then they just do it again.
Yeah, I could see that about Dave, that he would be like old school in that.
Yeah, and Steve too. Steve Gad Band, all those albums, just those guys playing live. I really miss that, and I hope that comes back.
Yeah, me too. I know. I find myself, not surprisingly, just listening to older music for that reason now.
Yeah.
I just, because that's what kind of turns me on more than a lot of the new stuff.
Well, and it's fun to hear like a police track where they're speeding up and slowing down, but that's part of it, that's part of the fun, the excitement, and the momentum.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, old Stones records, Charlie, and even some of the old Beatles. I mean, Ringo has incredible time, but there are some songs where it just gets exciting, and that's what's supposed to happen. I mean, Steve Gad, Rick Marotta, anybody would tell you that.
Well, just like Charlie on the song Start Me Up. I love how he hits the snare on one.
Yeah.
I remember when I first heard that, I was like, whoa, that's pretty cool.
There are so many like examples of stuff like that with him. That's a great example. That's because that was a big hit song. But so many things I realized later. Like I listened to him when I first started playing. He was the first drummer that I really, really listened to and tried to learn by because I didn't take drum lessons. And I'd hear him do things that I just thought were normal. And later realized, oh, that isn't really right. Like Start Me Up is a good example of like, the way he comes in there.
Yeah.
But when you're a kid, you sort of memorize things and you think, okay, I'll just memorize this and I'll play the snare on one,
Or how about his
there's
thing
a
where
live-
when he's doing the hi-hat, he doesn't hit the hi-hat when he hits the snare. I remember seeing
Yeah.
Steve Jordan doing that, getting the idea from him.
Exactly. And that's something he did that later. I mean, it was in the 60s and 70s, he was still playing, he'd play like eighth notes on the hi-hat all the way through. And
Right.
at some point he started to do that lift. But there's like a live version. If you ever get a chance to listen, there's a live version from 1969 of the Stones on the Get Your Yeah-Yeahs Out album, playing the song, Chuck Berry song, Little Queenie.
Yeah.
In the intro, he's playing the beat backwards. He's playing the snare on the 1 and the 3.
Almost like a reggae thing.
Yeah. And when I learned that song as an 11-year-old kid, and I thought that's how it went because I just would play along to the record. And I realize now that a lot of times he couldn't hear Keith's and he'd get turned around on the beat. Or Keith would turn the beat around, but you hear him. I think when Mick comes in singing, give it a listen. It's Little Queenie, Get Your Yeah-Yeahs Out. When Mick starts singing, Charlie, I think, waits, and then he realizes where the beat is and comes back on 2 and 4. But I had no idea at the time that was a mistake.
You were thinking he was taking
his
artistic license.
Yeah.
My favorite Stones track has always been Ventilator Blues, which a lot of people don't know, but man, I love the groove on that one.
Me too. Oh my God. That whole album, Exile on Main Street, my favorite Stones record. There's so many great tracks, like hidden, like album tracks like that.
Yeah.
Ventilator Blues, though, that's one that's just got so much attitude and grease and mojo and
way behind the beat. It's so cool.
Yeah, the sound of his snare drum on that song too is just great. So great.
All right, Steve Gad said once, I believe in a higher power, and what I've learned is that spirituality is a lot different to just religion. So I hope that spirituality enters into my playing, although it's not because that's what I decide to do right before I play as much as hopefully that's the way I'm trying to live my life. And the playing is an extension of that.
I think that sounds just like Steve to me, that he's not making a religious statement necessarily.
Yeah.
I think he's I would use the word, Zen, that he's just channeling some kind of spiritual thing, power that comes into his aura as he's creating, as he's playing. I mean, does that make sense?
He almost makes me think of that Keith Richards quote when he thinks that we receive music like a radio transmission, that it's out there and we just pick it up. And when I see Steve, I think of that a lot.
Yeah, I mean, as I've got to know Steve, I've realized that he's and Carol too, of course. That they're very spiritual. Yeah, and they like they don't want to put anything negative out there.
Yeah.
And the atmosphere, and my wife, she's a great influence and on me in that regard too, because I'll say something and she'll say, now, honey, let's not put any of that out there. Let's just think good thoughts. Let's not put any of that. And Steve is like that because you'll never hear him. I've never heard him say anything bad about anyone.
I've rarely seen him get angry, and I'm not going to name any names, but I remember a time he was over at my house when we had started the website, when we were talking, and he had invented, let's just say, something for drummers, and it was really cool. And then he found out that somebody had stole his idea and put it on the market before he did. And I remember him and Carol, and he was starting to get upset, and then he just takes a deep breath and he goes, I'm doing pretty well. And I'm pretty happy with the things I have in life, so I'm just going to let it go. And that just stood with me forever. I mean, that was like 25 years ago. And I was like, wow, that takes a lot to take a breath, and realize, I got to pick my battles. This really doesn't matter.
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about too, and that sounds exactly like Steve. And I will tell you, there were a couple of times during at least that first clinic tour we did when we were still sort of working some of the bugs out, the Mission from Gad tour.
Yeah.
There were a couple of times where he got a little mad about just how long things were taking.
Yeah.
And and I was the guy he would get mad at, because who else is he going to get mad at? But, sometimes the autograph sessions could go for hours.
Oh, that'll burn
And
anybody out.
he'd be exhausted, and everybody wants a photo, and he doesn't want to ever say no to anyone.
Yeah.
And I would be the guy kind of trying to move things along, and I'd have to tell someone, you got your photo. Can we just, can you only sign 2 of these albums and not 12? And then Steve, this is the great thing about Steve, is I know he'd be dying to get out of there, but then he'd turn to me and he'd go, "No, John, it's cool, man. It's cool. Let him, I'll take another photo." I'd be like, "You're going to kill me, Steve. You're killing me."
Yeah.
But I remember at one point he said to me, "Man, this trying to do this after the clinic is killing me, because, or going out to dinner after the clinic for 2 hours and then getting on the bus." He said, can we just not do that every night?" And I said, "Yeah, I'll explain to the dealers that," because all the dealers wanted to take him out to dinner. They all wanted to go out afterward, and they'd make a reservation at a really nice restaurant, but it's like 9:00 at night, and we have a 7-hour ride ahead of us after that. So we would sort of pick and choose those situations, and I would be the one to go and say, "Guys, unfortunately, we can't join you tonight, but sorry about that. Maybe next time." And he would never get mad. That's the great thing about him, is he finds a way to just keep that positive kind of Zen thing,
Yeah, I can only say good things about the Gads, how Steve and Carol have affected my life in a positive way. I mean, my God, Carol has helped me with my health so much over the years.
Oh, that's great.
And one of the great things I love Steve does is whenever he brings his band to Catalina's, I always bring my drum students, and they're terrified as we go into the green room and meet him. But he's always like, "Hey, man." And I always go, "Hey, Steve, they have a dog. Ask him about his dog." And so that,
How old
puts
are your students now?
Anywhere from like 4 to 15.
That's awesome.
And
Sorry,
but
continue.
here's what I love, though. He always, they're like, "Oh, tell me about this." And he goes, "No, man, tell me, what kind of music do you like? What kind of drums do you have? What do you, tell me about yourself." And he flips it to be on the focus of the kid, and then they calm down, and then they can talk about dogs.
Yeah. Yep. He's always, exactly. He would always be that way. He would zero in on like a young kid in the audience with his dad who'd come over to meet him, and you could see the kid was shy, and he'd go, "How you doing? What's your name? Yeah. So how do you like being a drummer? What do you like? Who are some of the guys you listen to?"
Yeah.
And I think sometimes kids would be a little embarrassed to say Travis Barker, and not him. And he'd go, "Oh yeah, he's really good. Yeah. He's great. Have you ever checked out this guy?" And, and Steve is never going to go, "Have you checked out what I do?" He would never do that.
Never.
And he makes everybody so comfortable, immediately. And I just have to tell you, when you mentioned Carol helping you with your health, that first tour we did in 2005, we started in San Antonio. We had a couple of days off when we got there, and we were talking about running. And I told Steve, I used to run in high school. I was on the track team and the cross country team, but I don't really run anymore because my feet started bothering me or something. He's like, "Man, you got to get the right shoes. We're going to get you some good shoes." And we went to a sporting goods store, and I bought a pair of running shoes and started running on that tour.
Yeah.
And I mean, it just brought it all back for me. And 20 years later, I went running this morning. I mean, I run, 5 days a week if I can.
Yeah. He's a real inspiration health-wise. He and Carol both. Absolutely amazing.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Before we go, though, I want to help you promote your stuff. So how can people watch or listen to Live from My Drum Room?
Well, I thank you. I appreciate it. I've just recently gone to the 20th century with a website, and people can visit I know it's so funny to hear that, my website in 2025.
Yeah.
And it is livefrommydrumroom.com. And I post like YouTube clips from past episodes. You can basically go to my YouTube channel, which is Live from My Drum Room, and watch all the shows are up there. I'm on all the podcast platforms, Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio,
Yeah, I mean,
everybody.
I gotta say,
Um,
I try to watch yours live because it's fun and it's interactive. But like a lot of other people, I'm often busy, and so I might wait to the next day because I know you're always going to repost it.
Absolutely. Everything right, exactly. And I try to remind people that if you miss it live, it's going to be up on YouTube either the same day or the next day or soon after. So um, I do the shows live, and I want to continue to do that. And I'm now streaming live on Facebook and YouTube at the same time. But yeah, so you can go to my website and you can get all that information, livefrommydrumroom.com. You can email me or text me at livefrommydrumroom@gmail.com. And if you have a question or want to contact me for any reason. And I do want to mention that I do sell some merchandise, T-shirts and hoodies.
Ooh,
And I created a scholarship last year with the
that
Percussive
was
Arts
that was
Society.
my next question. Tell me about the scholarship.
Great. Well, so I this is a scholarship. I've been wanting to do something for a while to just sort of give something back, and this really made the most sense to me. So everything, every penny that I make from selling these T-shirts and hoodies goes toward endowing that scholarship. And the scholarship allows a student or probably anyone to attend the PAS, Percussive Arts International Convention, which is held in Indianapolis every year. It pays for someone to attend that.
Oh, that is so
Um,
cool.
yeah, I'm really proud of it, and you can go onto the pas.org website and find their scholarships. And I've got a link on my website as well where you can find it, and you can. There's criteria, and they are the ones that determine who the winners are. But I'm happy and honored to offer this scholarship. And as I say, the merch that I sell, it all goes toward that. So you buy a T-shirt, it's going to a great cause.
That's incredible. At a
Um,
time when the
yeah.
world is uncertain, it's great that you're doing positive things.
Well, thank you. I appreciate
All
that.
right, last question. What
Um,
if I wanted to go see a band with a really good left-handed drummer, and the band is called Grand Theft Auto? When and where are they playing next?
it's actually audio. It's a little play on words there.
Grand
It's
Theft
we
Audio. Okay.
Yeah, it's we steal music, not cars. That's our we're a classic rock cover band. And Malcolm, you could come see us in beautiful Lawrence, Massachusetts in just a couple of weeks, the first weekend of May.
Okay.
We will be playing at a new venue. But we play a few times a month, and it's great fun. One of the guys in the band I've known literally 50 years. I think I was 14 and he was 12 when we met. Yeah, it's just so funny that we played in bands for years after that, and then I got out of playing for about 20 years, and then I joined this band in 2014, so 11 years ago, and it's just fun, playing old Beatles and Stones and Who songs and having a great time.
That's awesome. Tell me one of the songs that you guys play. What's one song that you just love playing with your band?
Oh man, we play a bunch of great Who tunes. We play Bargain, and I really get to stretch in that one, from Who's Next.
Yeah, yeah.
Going Mobile. I mean, anything that Keith Moon played, drummers get to stretch. But even the simplest songs by the Beatles, where I'm pretty much just playing two and four, are just so fun to play. Just the music's great. I'm with friends, and we're just getting to do something that I thought I would never get to do again. I thought once I sort of gave up playing and started working in the business, my days of playing in a band were behind me. And I never anticipated, in my 50s, getting back into playing again like I did back then.
That sounds like a real blast.
It is. And I'll just tell you, just speaking of Steve, he was really instrumental when I got back into playing, and literally every day checking in with me to see what I was working on that day. When I told him I would join this band, and I remember him lecturing me because I was trying to I was trying to play. You know what I mean? Steve,
Yep.
I was trying to play like I played when I was in my 20s, when I was pretty good. And I'm like, yeah, Steve, I just can't. My double stroke roll is sloppy, and it's I feel like my playing is kind of rigid. And he's like, well, what are you doing? What are you doing to make it better? And I'm like, well, I'm sitting here and playing this song. She's like, well, man, you can't. It's not going to happen overnight, man. And he would like, he gets that way. He's
Yeah.
like, don't. Yeah, he'd be like, yeah, just like, just listen to me.
Yeah.
Work on the pad. Play slow. Just play everything really slow. Don't try to play fast.
Yeah.
That's and you'd be like, that's bullshit. Just don't try to do that. Just don't try to. And he was right. He was like, he was like, just work at it and it'll come back to you. And he was right.
John DeChristopher since 1960. Thanks so much for talking to me today.
Really been a pleasure, Mal. I so appreciate you having me. Thank you.
Peace.